This is Cogitations with Carl Hartman, minister at Main Street Church of Christ in Lockney.
Good morning. I'm glad you tuned in your radio today to 106.1 The Flip FM and to join us for another episode of Cogitations. We had a good guest on last Sunday, a lot of good information regarding just resources that are out there with Apologetics Press and which can be utilized in your Bible study and also just garnering a lot of knowledge that surrounds the Scriptures, particularly when it comes to evidences that support the Bible narrative and the truths and the facts that are presented there. I got another guest on with me today. This guest has come in from Washington State. This is a very special guest for me. I have with me Sarah Hancock, who just happens to be my daughter. You want to say hi to everybody, Sarah?
Hello.
And I thought since she was in town visiting her mother and I, that I might have her on and have a little bit of a discussion with her when it just comes to our own spiritual lives and experiences in our religious walk and just the different things that can affect different demographics of people during different times of their life. Now, she has the perspective of growing up in a preacher's house and maybe some of the unique pressures. And we're going to kind of walk through her life. She's still early on in life. She's a couple of weeks away from 21. So she's really early in life. But she can just talk a little bit about first stage, kind of growing up in what a lot of times we call the fishbowl. You're this preacher's kid and you're growing up in the preacher's home and the expectations that are there. So first, how did that impact your spiritual development and your spiritual life?
I think it made it a lot easier in some aspects because you have to go to church. You don't have a choice really most of the time. So it sets a good foundation, I would say, starting out in your faith.
How does that lack of choice translate to later on in life when you're leaving home and now the choice is yours? Do you find it during that transitional period? Is there like a feeling of, well, now I don't have to do it, so I'm not going to? Or, just making that transition and finding your own motivation and your own reason to stay faithful, and particularly faithful in attendance to the opportunities to assemble together with the church. How does that transition from let's get up and get going? I know I used to say a lot of times as y'all were growing up, and I was that person that, especially being a minister, I'm there early. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times mom and the kids would come along later. But when I was trying to stir everybody up, a lot of times I used the phrase, well, everybody who loves Jesus, get up and start getting ready to go for Bible study or for worship or whatever was on the schedule for that particular time. And so you move from having that kind of that motivator to having to find that self-motivation. So what was your experience in that transition? Because I know there's a lot of young people out there who might be listening, or parents who are listening to this program whose kids might be approaching that transition. And so just what that transition looked like for you, and maybe some things that might help them make that transition and maintain their faith.
I think, since I did grow up going and having to go all the time, when I got out on my own and I didn't go, it just felt wrong. I felt like I was disobeying my rules that my parents set for me, even though I'm in my own house and I don't have rules. I feel like I'm going to get in trouble. But I did struggle after moving, or when I wasn't in you guys' house anymore, with getting up and going, because once you get out of the habit of it, it's very hard to get back in. So it was definitely a struggle. Not that I didn't want to go to church, but I realized once you start working, a full week, you really, your weekends are very sacred to you with not doing anything. So I think I just struggled with not wanting to have to leave the house at all. But once, now I am back in the habit of it, and it makes me a lot happier in life. I would sit at home on the weekends and complain that there's nothing to do and be depressed. But now that I am in church and I'm involved, not only do I go to church on Sundays, but there's so much throughout the week that you can get involved in, and even on the weekends get involved in, that just make your life happier and make you feel like you're doing more in life than just going to work and going home and doing nothing on the weekends that seems productive.
Right. And a lot of young people go through that. I know leaving home when I was, after I graduated high school, I was literally out of the house 6 days later. And I was in basic training for the Navy out in San Diego. Went from El Paso to San Diego, went from graduating from high school to 6 days later in basic. And of course, you're in basic for 9+ weeks there. And of course, you're not going anywhere. Yeah. And then from basic, you go to your first school command. And even there, for pretty much the first 2 months, we were fundamentally restricted to base. And so you end up with, 4 or 5 months there that whatever habits you once had are not your habits anymore. And you have to reestablish those new habits and get yourself motivated to get up and to go. And you talked about, work and this work-life balance, and really this work and Christian balance that we have to obtain and learn. And I can just say, welcome to the real world, daughter. Yeah. Right? It's the real world. And that's what, us adults have to do, is find this balance. But what we kind of miss sometimes is that we are Christians first. There's that passage there in Acts chapter 11, talks about the disciples at Antioch. And there's that passage there, and we get it wrong, where it says the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. And a lot of times we break down words and examine words, but a lot of times we look at big words and not the little words. And that word called there in the Greek references your chief order of business. It's what you're known for. So like in the Bible, you might read about Simon the tanner. And so in Simon's name and how people would relate to Simon, he's Simon the tanner. Tanner is what he's called. Tanner is his chief occupation, what he's known for first and foremost. And so it's not talking about in that passage that's the first time chronologically in history that the disciples were referred to by the term Christian. No, the disciples in Antioch were living their Christian lives so out in the open, and in their prioritizing of their life, their obligations to Christ and to God were first and foremost. After all, we're told, seek ye first the kingdom of God. That when people saw them walking down the street, and I'll just use that same individual, Simon the tanner, they wouldn't call him Simon the tanner. They would call him Simon the Christian tanner. The disciples were called Christians first, and how people referenced them, because that was their chief order of business. And so all of us as individuals need to prioritize our lives so that we're Christians first in everything. And it's hard. It's a different struggle for every single individual. And especially when you're going from childhood to adulthood, and the motivators are different. We had a camp once when I was in Alabama, and one of the partners that I was working this camp with was a retired Marine Corps drill sergeant. And so I was actually going to a school with him to get a degree in biblical studies, and we're doing this Christian camp together one summer. And he's giving this talk, and he's getting this Marine Corps drill sergeant rap. If you can just imagine that in your head. I'm not going to try to duplicate his rap as he's walking amongst the auditorium of teenagers, and we're actually outside in a pavilion, and he's talking about motivation. And he's talking about, why your parents get you up and make you go to Bible study, and why your parents make you go to worship, and why your youth minister just makes you go to devotionals and makes you go to camp and makes you go on youth retreats and makes you do this and makes you do that. And then he kind of just blurts out there, because forced motivation is better than no motivation at all. And that's what happens when we're kids. Our parents kind of force our motivation in a lot of things. It could be not just within our life as a growing disciple of Christ, but also in school and other organizations we might get involved in, whether it's Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or any other kind of endeavor in life. A lot of that motivation comes from the parents. But then one day you wake up and you're on your own. Yeah. And you got to find your own motivation. And I think as parents, a lot of times it behooves us as much as we can. Of course, you still got to keep, guiding your children in the right direction. But early on, before they even leave the house, to kind of help them discover their own motivation for doing the positive things in life. So let's leave that transition, okay, from childhood. Well, before we leave that, we kind of jumped to the end when you're transitioning out of the house. Let's just go back again before we move on into childhood. Were there any particular struggles within your childhood that you think were kind of unique, or the way you went through that struggle was unique because you're a Christian? Most youth become Christians or when they're growing up in that Christian household in their teenage years. So in those teenage years, what was unique and difficult maybe in maintaining your spiritual walk as you're maneuvering through those teenage years?
I think it would just be not fitting in with everyone around you, especially high school, middle school. Everybody's drinking, smoking, vaping now, or just partying, and that's wrong and you don't want to do that, but you're not, quote unquote, the cool kid if you don't do that. And so, like when we lived in Georgia, you guys always told me that it's okay to be different. Who cares if somebody doesn't like you if you're not cool because you don't do this? So it never really bothered me, but I think it's just high school is a hard time as it is. And then if there's no one around you that is going through the same thing or is in the same faith as you, then it's even more of a struggle. Like in Georgia, there was no youth group really at the church. But once we moved to Tennessee, it was definitely a lot easier because there was a more present youth group that was more of your age, not a different age range. So, but I think it would just be fitting in high school. Yeah. High school is a hard time for everybody in general. So,
yeah. We actually, over at the Main Street Church of Christ in our class this past Sunday morning, that topic came up a little bit, and I kind of mentioned there that all of us as human beings suffer from the same social disorder. It's a psychological disorder, and we all have it in varying degrees, and it's called adaptive inferiority complex. And what that basically means is when we begin to exist and function in any group in society, and as we're there for a time, if we are not like the people around us, so it could be like you move to a new work environment even as an adult, and the people in that work environment have their own mannerisms, their own culture, their own way of communicating, and maybe you're a Christian and you move into a work environment where everybody there, when they're talking, is just using vulgarity. Or they're going on smoke breaks all the time. Or after work, they're constantly going out for drinks. And we get in this environment, and when we're in that environment and we're surrounded by people that are different, we begin to feel inferior because we're not like them. Mm-hmm. And so since we feel inferior, we begin to have this desire to adapt our morals, our ethics, our norms in order to fit the culture around us. And so we all as human beings suffer from that. But I like in Titus chapter 2, verse 14, it talks about there how Jesus gave himself to redeem us from every lawless deed, to redeem for himself. Now, the King James here uses the term peculiar, to redeem for himself a peculiar people. Some other translations say a special people or a people of his very own. The King James uses the term peculiar, different. And that's really what we're supposed to be. We're different than the world and the way the world thinks and the way the world acts. And it's not always easy.
No.
It's not always easy to be the oddball.
I always, when I feel, or I get nervous about being different or feeling out of place or not being like everyone around me, I just think about how Jesus was persecuted, and he says, as Christians, you'll be persecuted. So sometimes when, nobody likes you or you feel like you don't fit in, you're doing something right because, that's what the Bible talks about. And that's the same thing that Jesus went through. So it's comforting in a way because you feel like you're doing something right and you're staying true in your faith.
Yeah, he was born a Jew within the Jewish society, but he didn't quite fit the Jewish mold, at least as far as how the hierarchy and the mainstream Jews, what their ideology and thought was of what it meant to be a Jew, and their understanding of the Mosaic law that governed them. And of course, we've in the ladies' Bible study we have on Wednesday at 10 a.m. over there at Main Street, Church of Christ in Lockney. We were even talking about that today. They added so much stuff to the Mosaic law that became their traditions and their customs, and they viewed it like law. He was a rebel to a lot of that stuff and was not accepted in general by that mainstream, hard-nosed Jewish group who had their ideologies, and he didn't conform to it. And it doesn't change as adults. You're a young adult now, and you're out working. Her husband's in the Army, and that's what took him up to Washington State, being stationed there. And so even as a young adult and later on in adulthood, it doesn't change, but I think as we become more confident in ourselves and in our identity as a Christian, it eases it. We may still have longings to belong, but also you can change your peer group. And like you said, as you kind of fell into a pattern of faithfully attending services and then taking advantage of the other opportunities to get together and to do things with Christians, you change your peer group. We have that passage that tells us bad company corrupts good morals. Well, guess what? Any kind of saying like that, the opposite's true. If bad company corrupts good morals, well, good company reinforces good morals. And so we can choose to a big degree the company that we keep, and we keep the right company. Well, we're going to transition a little bit. We're down to about 11 minutes left on the program, and go from this childhood, teenage years, and that transition out of mommy and daddy's house and standing on your own and those struggles to entering into marriage. You're fresh into marriage. Y'all are coming up on what? Year number 2 in December?
Yeah.
Year number 2 in December. And so how was that transition? Because some of this you were experiencing at the same time as far as kind of leaving home and leaving a good, solid church environment to being transplanted at the time from Tennessee to Washington State in a new marriage, in a new environment with no support group there at all. So what did you find in as a Christian in that transition? I know in part of that you were going through this kind of reestablishing the habit that you've already talked about. So beyond reestablishing that habit, just as a young couple getting started out, what's some of the spiritual nuances that you experienced and went through?
I think the most important thing is both of you have an understanding together that you know what you're supposed to do so you can support each other and also kind of push each other to do the right thing at the same time. I have a friend, and she's struggling with getting her husband to go to church with her. They have a child, and her and her child go to church, and her husband refuses to go with her. So it makes me very thankful that I have a husband that believes and goes. And I think it's important to, probably before you get married, to both have the same understanding and the belief when it comes to your faith. And so that's very helpful, especially being young and married and out on your own with, far away from your family, to have each other and to support each other in that.
Yeah, because ultimately, once you enter into that union, that should be the person you're walking through the rest of life with. Should be. I know at the wedding for my daughter, I officiated that wedding, but one of the things that her and Dylan wanted to include in that wedding was this braiding of rope. Some of you may be familiar with that. If not, you can look it up. And I don't remember all the verbiage or something that you read along with it. But the bride and the groom stand there, and there's basically like a plaque, and it has 3 cords on it, and you braid those cords together. And one cord represents the bride, one cord represents the groom, but the third cord represents God. And so you are weaving this new relationship together, but involved in that relationship and what really binds you together is God and that third cord and having God active. Now, I've tried to braid before and braid hair, and actually I make some jewelry and I've done some braiding in that. And I don't know about you, but you can't braid 2 cords.
No.
You can twist 2 cords, and as soon as you let go of one of the 2 ends, what happens? It unravels. But if you have 3 cords, those you can braid. You need at least 3 to braid. So in any kind of relationship, and the marriage relationship is the most important earthly relationship, you need that third braid. That third cord to braid in there and bind it all together. And so that's just a beautiful symbology that was included in that wedding ceremony to just emphasize that, hey, me and you are moving forward with God.
Yeah.
And to have God be that active part. And it is, like you said, a discussion that needs to be had before you're married.
Yeah.
Because religion can be a big stressor in a marriage. Religion and finance is the number 2 things that stress a marriage, and particularly early on. And so it's good to have those conversations. Anything else coming in as an early couple before we transition to one last thing?
Just communication, which you need all throughout your life for any relationship that you're in. But that's one thing that I think we're very good about, especially, and I know for a lot of younger people, you have your phone and your social media. You don't just talk to each other a lot or sit down and talk to each other. So Dylan always says, well, I can't read your mind. I don't know what you want. So I think
we can't. Guys cannot read your ladies' minds.
He's always like, well, I guess I should just know. But especially in an early marriage, and it's just both of you, to communicate and really try and be each other's best friends, because people come and go in life, but you two are in it for the rest of your lives. So if you can be best friends with each other and love each other and communicate, then you'll make it through anything.
All right. Well, we got about 6 minutes left, and let's enter one other aspect of your life. Now, you had a little bit of a taste of this as a child. You didn't experience full-time military with Dad. I was already out of active duty, but I was in the National Guard pretty much all the way through elementary and middle school. Maybe 9th grade-ish is when I retired from the military altogether. And I was doing, pastoral work at the same time. I was a minister at the same time, because National Guard's at 1 week in the month, 2 weeks a year, and occasional vacation overseas. But now you're a spouse of someone in the military. I mean, he was going to basic before you all were married, and you got married right after his basic training before he went to his initial school for his job, and then you were pretty much on your own. Yeah. Living with mother-in-law until he got his permanent duty station after school there in Washington and went and joined him there. So as a young couple in the military, a military family, what are some particular obstacles and struggles in your spiritual lives as that young couple kind of planted in the military culture?
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is the community. I know the military sometimes gets a bad rep for the community and the things that they participate in outside of their job. And it is really hard. There's not a lot of people that, there's not a lot of my husband's friends that go to church or have families and that are good influences for you to be around. You can be a good influence for them, but you need people that are, doing the same things that you are, that you can both influence each other to do the right thing. And there's not a lot of that, and that's a really hard struggle. You're thrown into the life and you want someone to relate to, but there's not a lot of them out there, unfortunately. And I'm friends with everyone. That's what I always say. I like to be friends with everyone. I'm nice to everyone, but you want to be around people sometimes that believe in the same thing as you, and that they're doing the right thing. Because, if you fall into the wrong crowd and you stay in the wrong crowd, you're going to eventually do the wrong thing.
You're going to adapt.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's nice to be able to influence other people, but you want a good influence in your life too.
Well, some advice I can give on that, and one of the things you all did is kind of found that community outside of the military. Plug into some congregation of believers wherever you're at. But even if you get more isolated, let's say you end up stationed in Japan, and you're there with your husband for 2 years, whatever. And I mean, there's churches everywhere. There's churches in Japan. There's everywhere. But to find that community that has more of the Christian-minded mindset, one place you can always go on every major military base is the chapel. And the chapel has more than just services on Sunday. There'll be a lot of other Christian-oriented programs there to plug into. Plus, most chapels are going to have a list of surrounding community congregations of all different natures. So you could come in there and just say, hey, I'm a Christian and I'm a practicing Christian of this particular persuasion. What's available in the community? And they can help you connect with that. And so there's those resources that are there. But it's as young people that are going out into the world on their own, that's what you have to do. And maybe that's the fundamental point of today's program, is to find the like-minded people of faith and attach yourself to them so that they can basically fulfill the opposite of that verse. Good company will reinforce those good morals, and you can keep walking. Well, our time is pretty much expired for today.
I was just going to say, and if you're not seeking good company or seeking God, then you're not going to find him. So if you're going to just sit at home and accept that there's no one around you that you can relate to, then you're not going to find him. But if you go out and seek, then you'll find him.
Oh, yeah. Well, the prophet was complaining to God that he was all alone and there was no one that served him. And then God revealed to him that there was thousands of others that had not soiled themselves in idolatry to the false gods and were still true. And he was not alone. Well, I thank my daughter for being on here. She didn't know what she was in for. I just drug her down here to make a recording at the radio station and threw her in front of a mic and no rehearsal and no script. No. And we're just like, let's just have a conversation. And it worked out, I think, fairly well. Well, again, I'm glad that you tuned in and that you joined us this Sunday morning here on Cogitations as we kind of contemplated and talked about what life is like as a young Christian and going through a couple of the different phases of life. And I thank Sarah again for sharing her experiences with us. I made plenty of notes as her dad. But I encourage you to tune in next Sunday morning and join us again here on Cogitations.
Tune in next Sunday at 9 for another edition of Cogitations with Carl Hartman, minister at Main Street Church of Christ in Lockney.